made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
Before the palace ever faced its most explosive family crisis, William had already seen something that reportedly made him uneasy. His warning was not shouted, leaked, or delivered for cameras. It was quieter than that, and according to the story, it disappeared behind palace doors, only to become far more important years later. William was not looking at Meghan simply as a new member of the family. He was looking at what her arrival could mean for a system built on rules, restraint, and carefully managed expectations. He allegedly sensed tensions before the public suspected anything deeper, and that placed him in an impossible position. He was a brother, but also an heir preparing for a future where private decisions could become royal problems. So the warning, if it was made as described, was not an attack. It was measured and restrained. William did not need to raise his voice to make the concern clear. He understood that confrontation could push Harry further away, while complete silence could allow a small disagreement to become something much larger. The danger was not simply what might happen, it was what might happen if nobody acted. Inside the palace, however, warnings rarely travel in a straight line. Concerns can be softened by advisors, delayed by protocol, or placed beneath the larger demand for family unity. Some people may have believed William was seeing problems too early. Others may have thought time would settle everything. Royal families had survived difficult disagreements before. Why should this be different? That assumption became crucial, because according to the story, several people understood William was uneasy. Yet the institution chose patience. The hope was simple: keep the family together, let relationships settle, and prevent private tensions from becoming public damage. It sounded reasonable, even compassionate. But beneath that decision was a risk no one could easily measure. What if the warning had not been premature? What if it had been the first sign of a deeper fracture? That is where the story begins to change. Later conversations, recollections, and alleged palace records could give new meaning to what once appeared to be an ordinary family disagreement. The most revealing detail may not be the exact words William used, but the decision made after those words were heard. And that decision would not end the problem. It would quietly move the problem forward. But a warning means little inside an institution trained to survive uncomfortable truths. And as the family moved forward, the palace's decision to contain the concern would create a second, far more dangerous problem. The most revealing decision may not have been William's warning at all. It may have been the palace's response. Behind polished speeches and carefully controlled appearances, an entirely different conversation was allegedly unfolding, one where officials had to decide whether protecting family unity was worth ignoring an uncomfortable prediction. The palace had faced difficult family moments before, but this situation carried a different pressure. There was an institution to protect, a relationship to preserve, and a future monarch watching events unfold. In that world, discretion was not weakness. It was survival. Problems were contained before they became headlines. Disagreements were softened before they became accusations, and private concerns were often buried beneath the language of duty. That created a dangerous choice. Some advisors could have viewed William's concerns as legitimate. Others might have believed he was reacting too strongly, seeing danger where patience could have solved the problem. The difference mattered because the palace was not deciding only how to respond to one family disagreement. It was deciding which loyalty came first: loyalty to individuals or loyalty to the crown. And silence became the answer. Nothing dramatic needed to happen. No public rejection was required. A conversation could simply remain private. A concern could be acknowledged and then placed aside. A difficult question could be postponed until tomorrow. But postponement inside the monarchy can become policy without anyone admitting that a decision has been made. The deeper mystery was who knew. Was William's concern understood by senior figures, or did it remain within a narrow circle? Did some officials recognize the seriousness, while others preferred not to confront it? And if people disagreed privately, how much of that disagreement ever reached the family itself? The consequences were emotional as much as institutional. William was left carrying the burden of believing something could go wrong while being expected to maintain family harmony. Harry could interpret restraint as distance or rejection. Others could see the same silence as necessary protection. Everyone could believe they were defending something important, and still move farther apart. That is what made the palace's choice so significant. Silence did not destroy William's warning. It preserved it, locked inside the institution like a secret whose meaning could only grow with time. And as later tensions emerged, that old concern would no longer sound premature. It would begin to sound like unfinished business. No one yet knew what followed. And once that silence became part of the palace's strategy, every later disagreement carried the weight of something far older, something William believed had already been seen coming. What looked from the outside like a disagreement between brothers was becoming something much larger inside the royal household. The real battle was no longer simply personal. It was about trust, duty, influence, and who believed they understood the future of the monarchy better than anyone else. The silence that had once been intended to protect the family was now creating distance within it. William and Harry were no longer simply navigating different personalities or different opinions. They were beginning to represent two very different ideas about what royal life should mean. For William, the crown was not something that could simply be stepped away from when circumstances became difficult. It was an inheritance, a responsibility, and eventually a duty he would have to carry. Every decision made around the family could create consequences for the institution that would one day rest on his shoulders. That awareness made his concerns increasingly serious. Harry appeared to want something different: greater freedom, greater control, and a life less restricted by expectations surrounding the monarchy. Neither desire was simple. One brother was looking toward the institution he was expected to inherit. The other was looking for space beyond it. And somewhere between those two visions, trust began to fracture. Meghan became an important catalyst in that changing relationship, but reducing the conflict to one person would miss the deeper problem. The real tension was about competing loyalties and expectations. Every private conversation could carry more meaning than it seemed to. A disagreement between brothers could become a question about the crown. A personal choice could become a question about precedent. Even silence could be interpreted as taking sides. That was when palace advisors allegedly began looking at the situation differently. This was no longer merely a family matter that could be settled over time. It had the potential to become an institutional crisis. And the most uncomfortable realization was beginning to emerge. William's original concerns were becoming harder to dismiss. The warning that had once been contained behind closed doors now seemed connected to a widening divide. Yet the palace still had to maintain the appearance of unity. The family could disagree privately, but the public expected stability. The monarchy could absorb tension, but it could not easily survive the perception that its own future was breaking apart from within. Soon, that tension would cross a dangerous boundary. Private feelings would begin producing public consequences, and once that happened, there would be no easy way to put everything back behind palace doors. Then came the moment when private discomfort could no longer remain entirely private, because the family's changing relationship with the palace began producing consequences that could be seen far beyond its walls. Once the family's private tensions began appearing in public, the palace faced a new threat: perception. Every gesture could become evidence. Every silence could become a headline. And every carefully chosen word could expose a disagreement officials had spent years trying to contain. What had once been controlled through private conversations was now entering a world where explanations could be demanded instantly. The palace communications teams faced an impossible task: preserve the image of family unity while the family itself was struggling to maintain it. Every statement had to be measured. Every response had to avoid making one side appear victorious and the other defeated. But public attention does not wait for perfect answers. Soon, competing narratives began forming. One interpretation suggested a family trying to manage painful differences. Another suggested something more deliberate was happening behind palace walls. And as those narratives collided, the disagreement became a battle over credibility. Who was telling the truth? Who was being protected? And who was being quietly pushed aside? Interviews and public appearances suddenly carried greater weight. A carefully chosen sentence could fuel speculation. A refusal to comment could create even more questions. Even an apparently ordinary palace response could be interpreted as evidence of a much deeper conflict. For the royals themselves, the pressure was relentless. They were expected to remain composed while private emotions continued to rise. William, in particular, had to navigate a brutal contradiction: maintain family dignity while watching the situation develop in ways that seemed to reinforce concerns he had allegedly expressed much earlier. And that changed the meaning of the original warning. What once sounded cautious could now appear remarkably significant. Events that had seemed unrelated began connecting in the minds of those watching closely. The palace was no longer simply managing a disagreement. It was responding to its consequences. The institution that had once relied on silence was now being forced to react to noise. Behind the scenes, questions inevitably followed. Had William's concerns been underestimated? Had officials moved too slowly? Had the desire to preserve harmony created a situation that was becoming harder to control? Nobody could easily admit that the original strategy might have failed, because doing so would mean confronting the possibility that the warning had been right. And that possibility was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The public saw fragments. The palace had the private context. Yet the emerging details suggested those fragments might belong to the same story. A conversation here, a decision there, a carefully worded statement somewhere else. Piece by piece, the pattern was beginning to take shape. And that was when the old warning acquired new power, because details once dismissed as insignificant suddenly appeared to form a pattern the palace could no longer comfortably ignore. Years later, the story begins to look different. Small details that once seemed meaningless suddenly carry enormous weight. A conversation here, a palace decision there, a carefully worded response somewhere else, and together they create a picture that raises one chilling question. What did William know before everyone else? That question now becomes the heart of everything that follows. Because the significance of an old warning can change when viewed through everything that came afterward. A decision that once appeared routine can suddenly seem deliberate. A delay that seemed harmless can look like hesitation. And a carefully controlled response can raise questions about what officials already knew but chose not to say. Within the dramatized account, alleged recollections from people close to the institution begin adding another layer of uncertainty. One person may remember a conversation as a serious concern. Another may remember it as little more than a disagreement. Someone else may insist the issue was never discussed at the level later claimed. And that contradiction makes the story more intriguing, not less, because memories do not always survive pressure intact. What matters is the pattern created between them. The emerging details suggest that some palace decisions may have been shaped by concerns that never appeared in public statements. That possibility changes the entire narrative. If officials were privately worried while publicly maintaining calm, then the silence was not accidental. It was a strategy. And strategies have consequences. Later developments could also transform the meaning of William's earlier concern. Something that seemed insignificant at the time might appear prophetic only after circumstances changed. That does not necessarily mean everyone understood the future. It means hindsight can expose connections that were invisible when decisions were first made. But there was another complication. Communication inside a royal household is rarely as simple as one person telling another everything they know. Information can be filtered through advisors, limited between households, or deliberately withheld to prevent tensions from spreading. A concern known by one group may never reach another in its full form. So the central mystery begins to shift. It is no longer simply, did William warn the palace? The more difficult question is, why did the palace fail to act on what he allegedly saw? That question carries a painful possibility. Perhaps some later fractures were inevitable. Perhaps they could have been softened. Or perhaps the choices made in the name of peace quietly pushed the family toward the very confrontation everyone had hoped to avoid. And that is where the story becomes more than a warning. It becomes a question of responsibility, judgment, and consequences. Because if the palace truly had an opportunity to respond differently, then the silence did not merely preserve a secret. It helped shape what came next. But the deeper the story goes, the less it resembles a simple warning, and the more it begins to look like a chain of decisions in which every attempt to preserve peace carried a hidden price. The palace had always understood the value of keeping family disputes private. But what happens when protecting the family becomes indistinguishable from protecting the institution? Behind that question lies the most painful possibility of all. Perhaps everyone believed they were preventing a crisis while quietly creating one. From inside the system, restraint could look like wisdom. Officials could believe that confronting every disagreement would only make matters worse. Keep conversations private. Avoid public confrontation. Give relationships time to settle. Protect the dignity of the family. The intention may have been peace, but peace without trust can become something very fragile. The problem was that short-term calm could hide long-term damage. Every unresolved issue remained beneath the surface, waiting for another disagreement to bring it back. And with every delay, the emotional distance grew harder to close. For William, the burden was especially complicated. He was still a brother, expected to care about Harry's happiness and protect their relationship. But he was also the future king, increasingly aware that the monarchy's stability would eventually become his responsibility. He could not simply think like a brother when every family decision appeared capable of affecting the institution he would inherit. That tension demanded sacrifice. William could remain silent to preserve family unity, but silence could also be interpreted as approval. He could speak more firmly, but that risked deepening the divide. He could trust the palace to manage the situation, yet the very strategy of management was becoming part of the problem. And from Harry and Meghan's perspective, the same restraint could carry an entirely different meaning. What palace officials viewed as caution might be experienced as coldness. What advisors considered necessary boundaries could feel like rejection. What one side saw as institutional protection, the other could see as exclusion. Two sides could believe they were responding to the same problem while living inside completely different versions of the truth. That is why better communication becomes such a painful question. Could a more direct conversation have prevented the escalation? Could William's concerns have been understood without turning them into a family confrontation? Could Harry have heard the warning without feeling that his independence was being threatened? Perhaps. But by this stage, the original concern may have been about something deeper than one particular disagreement. It may have reflected William's recognition that the expectations surrounding royal life and the desire for independence were becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. And once trust begins disappearing inside a family, protocol cannot simply replace it. Titles cannot repair it. Carefully written statements cannot restore what private conversations have broken. The palace had tried to protect everyone from an open confrontation, yet the price of that protection was becoming impossible to ignore. And as trust weakened, another question emerged, one that reached beyond family feelings and into the future itself. Who would ultimately decide what the monarchy could tolerate? William was not simply watching a family crisis unfold. He was watching the institution he would eventually inherit absorb the consequences. That changed everything. Every decision became a lesson. Every confrontation became a warning, and every compromise carried implications for the monarchy he would one day lead. The question was no longer only about what had happened between family members. It was about what those events might teach a future king. William had to think beyond the immediate emotion of a disagreement and consider what could happen when personal choices collided with institutional responsibility. For a future monarch, forgiveness and trust are not always the same thing. Someone can be forgiven as family and still face boundaries within a sensitive institution. That distinction becomes especially important when private relationships can influence public expectations. The heart may say one thing, the crown may demand another. And that was where the palace faced its unspoken choice. How much accommodation was enough? Every exception could create a precedent. If one arrangement was accepted, would others expect the same treatment? If one boundary was relaxed, could it be relaxed again? The palace was not simply dealing with one family relationship. It was considering what its decisions might mean for future generations. For William, that created another emotional conflict. He could want peace with his brother while still believing that certain limits were necessary. He could understand Harry's desire for independence without agreeing with every consequence of that independence. Protecting the family did not necessarily mean removing every boundary. And perhaps the original warning influenced how William approached those boundaries later. If he had already recognized a deeper problem, subsequent developments would naturally make him more cautious. What once might have been handled through accommodation could increasingly demand clarity. The palace, too, appeared to be moving toward a harder position. The earlier hope that time would solve everything was becoming less convincing. Accommodation had its limits. At some point, the institution had to decide what it could accept and what it could not. That shift carried powerful symbolism. William was moving closer to the center of the monarchy's future, while Harry's relationship with the institution was moving in another direction. Their paths, once joined by family and duty, were becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile. And this is where the emerging details become most revealing. Was William's warning simply personal? Was it concern for his brother? Or had he already understood that the conflict involved something larger, the collision between individual freedom and institutional duty? Perhaps it was all three. What matters now is what followed. The consequences were no longer theoretical. The choices made during those earlier years had begun shaping relationships, expectations, and the future balance of the royal family itself. By then, the question was no longer whether the warning had mattered. It was whether the palace had finally understood what William had been trying to protect. In the end, the most explosive part of the story may not be what William allegedly said. It may be what happened after the palace heard him. Because if the emerging details are placed together, the warning becomes something far more haunting. A moment when the future was glimpsed, understood, and still allowed to unfold. The power of that warning lies in everything that came after it. A concern can be dismissed. A disagreement can be forgotten. But when later events seem to echo an earlier fear, the past suddenly demands to be reconsidered. What once appeared minor can take on a completely different meaning, and what seemed like hesitation can begin to look like a choice. That is the deeper story here. Foresight versus institutional hesitation. Royal families survive by compromise. They have to. Personal feelings cannot always dictate public decisions, and duty often requires people to accept arrangements they would never choose privately. But compromise becomes dangerous when trust begins to disappear. Without trust, every compromise can feel like surrender, and every attempt at peace can create another reason for resentment. The emotional cost is impossible to separate from the institutional one. William was left balancing brotherhood against duty. Harry faced an increasingly complicated relationship with the family and the institutions surrounding it. Meghan became part of a conflict whose consequences reached far beyond any single relationship. And the wider family had to absorb the strain while continuing to represent stability. The palace had once faced a choice between confrontation and containment. It chose restraint. But restraint did not make the underlying tension disappear. It simply changed where that tension would eventually surface. Now, the emerging details invite a different interpretation. Perhaps William was not trying to control his brother. Perhaps he was trying to protect the monarchy. Perhaps he was trying to protect the family from a rupture he believed could become impossible to repair. Or perhaps he was trying to protect both. That uncertainty matters because warnings are rarely as simple as they sound years later. People misunderstand one another. Motives become blurred. Memories change. Private conversations are remembered differently by different people. And royal history is often shaped not by the statements made publicly, but by the decisions made quietly when nobody else was listening. William's future makes that even more significant. He will inherit more than a throne. He will inherit the consequences of choices made before he became king. Every compromise, every boundary, every unresolved family wound becomes part of the institution he is expected to carry forward. And perhaps that is why the old warning refuses to disappear. Because the real question is no longer simply whether William was right. It is whether the palace could have acted differently, and whether the price of waiting was greater than anyone understood at the time. There may still be conversations whose full meaning remains unknown. There may be palace records, private recollections, and missing pieces that could alter how this chapter is understood. And until those pieces emerge, one possibility remains impossible to ignore. The warning may have been forgotten by the institution, but it was never truly erased from the story. Because inside the monarchy, the most consequential revelations rarely arrive with a palace announcement. They emerge slowly, piece by piece, until an old warning suddenly sounds less like history and more like a message the future was never meant to hear.